My daughter took every cent of my $10 million in savings, saying she'd handle it better. 1 month later, she was at my door, begging for rent money. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, a long, tired sound that filled the quiet of the morning. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, soft and thin, laying golden lines across the floor. I was stirring my tea when I heard it. Firm, urgent. The kind of knock that doesn't wait for welcome. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe I imagined it. But it came again, harder this time. When I opened the door, there they were, my daughter Emma and her husband Jason. Their designer coats were wrinkled, faces pale beneath the shine of expensive skincare. The smell of desperation clung to them stronger than their perfume. Emma's mascara had run, leaving small rivers beneath her eyes. She looked at me the way a child looks at a locked candy jar, hungry, helpless, ashamed. Jason stood behind her, jaw tight, phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. "Mom," she started, voice trembling. "Can we come in?" I didn't answer right away. My eyes drifted past them to the sleek black car parked at the curb, repossession tags still taped to the window. The neighbors were pretending not to look, but curtains shifted quietly all down the street. And in that moment, as the kettle clicked off behind me, I remembered another morning, 1 month earlier, when the same girl smiled across my dining table and said, "Mom, you don't need to worry about money anymore. We'll take care of everything." I believed her. Because that's what mothers do. You don't expect betrayal from your own child. But greed? Greed turns family into strangers faster than time ever could. Emma's voice broke the silence again. "Please, Mom, just for a little while, we lost everything." I looked at her, not with anger, not even pity, just the quiet knowing of someone who's already been emptied once. I opened the door, and with a steady breath, I said softly, "This time, I don't owe anyone a thing." My name is Margaret Brooks. I'm 62 years old, a widow, and for most of my life, I've been good with numbers. Maybe too good. For 35 years, I worked as an accountant for a small logistics firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I liked things that added up neatly. Columns that balanced, receipts that matched, problems that could be solved with a calculator and patience. Life, unfortunately, doesn't work that way. But back then, I still believed it could. My husband, Daniel, used to say I was born with a ledger in my heart. He'd laugh every time I wrote the grocery totals on a yellow pad or when I reminded him to keep the gas receipts for tax season. He was the dreamer, I was the planner. Together we made things work. Him with the ideas, me with the spreadsheets. When Daniel passed away unexpectedly, Emma was only 16. I remember the day too clearly. The hospital hallway, the quiet, the smell of antiseptic that never quite left my clothes. That night, when I came home alone for the first time, I sat at the dining table and wrote everything down. The hospital bill, the mortgage, the insurance payout. It wasn't cold-hearted, it was survival. I didn't know what else to do but make things make sense. And slowly, they did. Over the next decades, I saved every extra dollar. I invested carefully, Nothing wild, just blue chip stocks, long-term mutual funds. Daniel's life insurance rolled into a safe portfolio. There were a few good years, a few bad ones, but I never chased luck. When the world was chasing crypto and fast money, I was clipping coupons and tracking dividends. My colleagues laughed, said I was too cautious. I smiled and told them, caution is just patience dressed differently. By the time I retired, I had nearly $10 million to my name. It wasn't magic, it was math. 35 years of steady saving, interest compounding, and a refusal to live beyond my means. I never bought the big house or the flashy car. My little two-bedroom home in the suburbs was enough. The paint peeled in a few corners, and the dishwasher had been on its last legs for 5 years. But it was home. Mornings were my favorite. I'd wake up before the sun, brew coffee, and walk the quiet streets before the neighborhood came alive. Sometimes I'd stop by the park, feed the birds, and say hello to Mrs. Green. She'd always have her dog and too many opinions about city council. Tuesdays were for volunteering at the church food drive. I liked sorting cans, organizing donation logs, simple work that reminded me that even order can be an act of love. At night, I'd sit at my desk, open my laptop, and update my personal spreadsheet. Savings, bills, interest projections, little notes to myself. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about peace. Numbers didn't lie. And in a world that often did, that was comforting. Then there was Emma, my only child. If I'm honest, she never inherited my patience. She was quick, ambitious, restless. From a young age, she wanted more. More excitement, more attention, more life. I admired that about her, even when it scared me. When other girls her age were reading novels, Emma was teaching herself to edit videos and post them online. She had that camera-ready smile, the kind that could sell anything. She knew exactly how to angle her face, how to speak in that bright, confident tone that made people listen. By her mid-20s, she'd built an online presence. Nothing huge, but enough to attract brands, sponsors, followers. I was proud of her. I really was. But she lived in a world of image, not substance. Her reality was filtered and captioned. Mine was written in ink and receipts. We were still close. At least, I thought we were. She'd visit on weekends, show me her latest posts, roll her eyes when I mentioned saving for emergencies. Mom, nobody saves anymore. We invest, we grow, we live. I'd laugh and shake my head. And when it all crashes, who catches you? She'd smile, that knowing smile, and say, I don't plan to fall. Then came Jason. He walked into her life and mine in a charcoal suit that fit too perfectly, with a watch that probably cost more than my car. He was smooth, charming, and always selling something. Real estate one month, tech startups the next. Every conversation with him felt like a pitch. He called me Mom too early, complimented my garden like it was a negotiation tactic. Mrs. Brooks, you have an investor's touch. You know, with your capital and my network, we could easily double your returns. I smiled politely, but inside I made a note, the same way I used to note risky accounts in the office. Family dinners became a performance. Jason would talk about his 7-figure portfolio, Emma would nod proudly beside him, and I'd quietly pass the potatoes, pretending not to notice how their words didn't quite line up with their eyes. Once, when I mentioned I'd paid off the mortgage early, Jason laughed. Mrs. Brooks, that's sweet, but you're leaving money on the table. Debt is leverage, not a burden. Emma added, Yeah, Mom, nobody keeps that much cash anymore. It's inefficient. I didn't argue. I just listened, the way I always had. Because I'd learned something over the years. The loudest people in the room are usually trying to drown out their own doubt. Still, I loved them. I really did. They were my family, the only one I had left. I wanted to believe that beneath all the noise and ambition, there was still that little girl who used to sit at the kitchen table and count pennies with me, who'd say, Mom, look, I saved a whole $1. But time has a way of changing people. Or maybe it just reveals them. Emma and Jason's world was built on fast success, instant gratification. Mine was built on waiting, on watching things grow, slowly and honestly. They'd tease me for it. Mom, you're too careful, Emma would say. You could have 10 more million if you'd just let us handle it. Jason would add with a grin. Yeah, Mrs. Brooks, you're sitting on a gold mine. You just need the right touch. I'd laugh softly and sip my tea, because I knew something they didn't. They thought I was small because I lived simply. But simplicity isn't weakness. It's clarity. I didn't need yachts or luxury condos to prove I'd made it. My proof was in the quiet, in the fact that I could sleep at night, that every dollar I owned had a name and a reason. Still, I could feel a shift. Emma called less often unless she needed advice on taxes. Jason started asking curious questions about my accounts, just for planning. Sometimes, when I caught their eyes during dinner, there was something new there. Not love, not even respect, something more like calculation. I brushed it off, told myself I was imagining things. They were family, my only family. And that was perhaps my biggest mistake, assuming blood meant safety. Because family can love you deeply and still take everything you have. That was who I was before it all fell apart. A woman who trusted too easily, who believed in fairness and balance. A woman who thought numbers protected her, when in truth, they were only ever as safe as the hands that held them. And those hands were about to let go. It began on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that smelled like baked apples and cinnamon. Emma and Jason had come over for lunch, their laughter filling the kitchen, the sound of something that still felt like family. I remember setting down the roast, smiling at how grown up she looked. Part of me was proud that she'd built a life so full of confidence. After dessert, Jason leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine like a man about to announce a plan. Mom, he said, voice casual but deliberate, we've been thinking. With the economy the way it is, inflation, market swings, all that volatility, it might be time to protect your assets. You've got a good thing going, and we want to make sure it stays safe. I looked up from the table. Safe from what? He smiled that patient smile people use when they think you don't quite understand. From the system, Mom. From taxes. From unnecessary fees. You've worked too hard to let banks nibble it all away. Emma jumped in, eyes shining with excitement. Jason's right, Mom. We've been reading about family trusts. Consolidating everything under one umbrella so it's easier to manage. It's smart, tax efficient. Everyone's doing it. Her tone was light, persuasive, the same tone she used as a teenager when asking for a credit card or a later curfew. But now she wasn't asking for freedom, she was asking for control. Jason reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neat folder. the kind printed on heavy paper with neat tabs and a pen clipped to the side. "It's simple," he said. "Just some paperwork to streamline things. You'll still have access to everything, but we'll handle the logistics. Less stress for you, you know?" He slid the folder across the table. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it, the cream-colored pages, the weight of it. My instincts stirred, soft but steady. This feels too easy. Emma reached over, placed her hand on mine. "Mom, it's just a power of attorney, for convenience, in case of emergencies. You'll still be in charge. It just helps us act quickly if something happens." Her hand was warm. Her eyes were soft. And after so many years of doing everything alone, the thought of letting someone else handle the hard parts, it felt almost like relief. I nodded slowly. "If it's just for emergencies." "Of course," Jason said quickly. "Nothing changes. You're still the boss." So I signed. My name, steady and familiar, at the bottom of the page. I didn't know then that it was the moment my life started to unravel. At first, nothing seemed different. My bills were paid on time, my balance steady. Jason would text occasionally. "Handled that transfer for you, Mom, don't worry." Emma sent photos of their dinners, their new couch, their weekend trips. They looked happy, thriving. "See, Mom, this is so much easier. You don't have to worry about a thing." And I believed her, because I wanted to. But then, small things began to change. My banking app asked for verification one morning, a new password, a new security key. When I called the helpline, they told me my access had been temporarily restricted due to account management updates. Probably just a technical thing, I told myself. They're tech people. I'm old-fashioned. I brushed it off. Then the envelopes stopped coming. Every month, I'd receive tidy white statements from the bank, interest summaries, portfolio updates, dividends. I'd file them neatly in a drawer by date. But now, the drawer stayed empty. When I asked Emma, she laughed lightly. "Oh, Mom, everything's digital now. Paper mail is outdated. We're managing it through the portal. Saves time, saves trees." She said it so easily, I almost felt silly for worrying. But sometimes, late at night, I'd sit at my desk and stare at the screen, the one that now showed only an error message where my balance used to be. It's funny how silence can sound like betrayal. How the absence of mail, of access, of transparency, can grow louder than words. I still remember the weight of that pen, the way it felt in my hand when I signed those good-for-you papers. Jason had called it streamlining. Emma had called it smart. But I would soon learn the truest name for it: erasure. It happened gradually, the way most losses do, not with an explosion, but with a series of quiet nods, small okays, and the soft erosion of trust dressed up as family concern. After the paperwork, Jason and Emma seemed busier than ever. They spoke in numbers and acronyms I didn't quite understand anymore. Not the comforting columns and balances I'd lived by, but a new kind of vocabulary. Liquidity pools, ROI optimization, tax efficiency, leveraged yield. The words shimmered with confidence, but beneath them was fog. A few weeks after I signed, Jason suggested selling my small rental house, the one Daniel and I had bought decades ago as a safety net. "It's underperforming, Mom," he said, smiling like a man who already had the solution. "You're losing out to inflation. We can reinvest that into something real, something that grows." I hesitated. That little house had been my quiet backup plan. The place I'd imagine moving into if times ever got hard. It wasn't fancy, but it paid for itself. It was mine. Emma jumped in, wrapping her arm around my shoulder. "Mom, come on. You've done enough worrying for one lifetime. Let us handle it. We'll make sure it works for you." And so, I let it go. The papers were signed within a week. Jason sent me a screenshot of the deposit for transparency and then promised, "We'll move it into the family account. Better management that way." That phrase, family account, sounded harmless then. Comforting even. I didn't realize it was the beginning of my disappearance. The months rolled by like a foggy highway. No clear view ahead, but I kept moving forward because they said it was fine. Jason and Emma began spending more time out of town, traveling for business opportunities. 1 week Aspen, next month Maui, then a networking event in Dubai. Their photos filled my phone. Emma in designer coats, Jason at rooftop bars, both smiling with champagne glasses raised high. At first, I told myself they deserved it. They were young, ambitious, enjoying life. But somewhere in the quiet between their calls, I began to notice how still my own life had become. I tried not to pry, but the silence grew heavy. My bank mail never returned. My online access remained locked with a polite message, "Invalid credentials. Please contact your administrator." Administrator. It used to be me. When I asked Jason about it, he laughed. A practiced, easy laugh. "Oh, Mom, that's just a permissions thing. We switched your portfolio to a managed account. It's standard procedure." "Can I see it?" "Of course," he said. "Once everything stabilizes. You know how the markets are." His tone made me feel naive for even asking, like a child tugging on an adult's sleeve in the middle of a serious conversation. Then came the moment that finally cracked the surface. I'd written a check to the church, a small donation for the new roof fund. I'd done it every year since Daniel died. It wasn't about money. It was a promise I kept for both of us. A week later, the pastor called me, his voice gentle but uneasy. "Margaret, dear, I'm sorry, but your check didn't go through. The bank said insufficient funds." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My chest tightened. Not from embarrassment, but confusion. That account was supposed to have more than enough. 10 million was supposed to mean never worrying again. That evening, I called Jason. He chuckled when I told him, "Oh, Mom, you worry too much. It's just a processing delay. You know how banks are, all algorithms and red tape." His voice was light, rehearsed, practiced. But there was something in his tone, something too calm, like he was speaking through a smile he no longer believed in. I started watching closer after that. Little things. The new car. Sleek, silver, not the kind you lease, but the kind you boast about. The condo upgrade with floor-to-ceiling glass. The designer furniture Emma posted online, tagged with captions like #hard work pays off. Each image was another brick in a wall I hadn't realized they were building between their world and mine. When I asked, Emma's response was always the same. "Mom, you need to stop thinking like an accountant. We're not spending, we're investing." Jason added, "Money's fluid, Mom. It moves, it grows. You can't hold it too tightly." But that's the thing about people who've never built something from scratch. They mistake movement for progress. I tried to log in again one night. My fingers shook as I typed. "Invalid credentials." I tried again. "Access denied." And when I finally called the bank, the voice on the other end said politely, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brooks, but according to our records, this account is managed under power of attorney by your authorized representative, Mr. Jason Cole." My throat went dry. He's my son-in-law," I whispered. "Yes, ma'am," the voice said. "He has full administrative control." That was the first time I realized the truth. Not just that I was locked out of my money, but that I was locked out of my life's work. The next Sunday, Emma called. Her voice was bright, practiced, the same one she used in her videos. "Mom, we noticed you tried to access the old accounts again. Don't worry, it's handled. You'll confuse the system if you log in directly. Just let us handle it, okay?" "Emma," I said softly, "I worked for every cent of that money. I just want to see it." She sighed. "Mom, please, you don't trust us?" That question, sharp and fragile, hung in the air. She said it like a wound, but it felt like a weapon. That night, I made myself a cup of tea, just like always. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that listens. I looked around at the walls Daniel had painted, the furniture we'd built together piece by piece, and I realized how much of my life had been about trust. Trusting that good people stayed good. Trusting that family meant safety. Trusting that love protected more than it could destroy. The steam from my cup blurred my vision, or maybe it was tears, I'm not sure. I wanted to believe that silence was strength, that waiting would somehow restore order. But deep down, a voice, faint but firm, began to stir. "They think silence means surrender," it said. "They're wrong." It was a Thursday afternoon, gray sky, soft drizzle, the kind of day that smelled like wet pavement and old promises. I'd just finished organizing the pantry when I decided to call Jason. I wanted to make a small donation to the local shelter, the same one that had helped me after Daniel died. They were short on supplies, and I had always told myself, as long as I have enough, someone else should too. "Jason," I said when he picked up, "could you transfer $10,000 from the main account to the community shelter fund?" There was a pause, longer than it should have been. Then a sigh. "Mom?" he began. His voice dipped in that patronizing calm. "That money is tied up right now. You can't just pull it out. We're in the middle of a reinvestment cycle. You'd get penalized." Penalized. Forgiving. I frowned. "It's my money, Jason. I'm not asking for $1 million. Just 10,000. You can figure that out." He chuckled softly, but it wasn't kind. "Mom, that's not how this works. You need to trust the process." The process. Another one of his words that meant no. Later that evening, they came over. Jason in a new jacket that still had the fold lines, Emma behind him scrolling her phone like she was allergic to silence. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same one Daniel and I had bought secondhand, the one where Emma once did her homework. "Mom," Emma started, her tone already sharp around the edges, "we noticed you tried to access the old accounts again." I blinked. Confuse the system? I was just checking on my own accounts. Jason leaned forward. "We know you don't mean harm, but the structure is delicate. You're not familiar with how these new platforms work." "And that's why I have you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I'd like to see where my money is. That's all." He slid a tablet across the table. "There! Look, the dashboard. See? All organized, all performing beautifully. Colorful charts, neat columns, impressive numbers. Except none of it looked real. It was like a presentation. Pretty, vague, distant." I reached for the tablet. "Can I scroll?" He hesitated. Just a flicker, but I saw it, that flash of panic behind his calm. "Of course," he said, too quickly, but when I tapped the login icon, a password prompt appeared. I typed mine. Access denied. Jason reached across the table. "Here, let me—" I pulled the tablet slightly closer. "No, I can do it." Then it happened. Fast and small, but final. He snatched it back. His hand brushed mine, firm and unyielding. The motion wasn't violent, but it didn't have to be. The air itself seemed to stop moving. "Mom," Emma snapped, her voice cracking like glass. "You're acting paranoid. You're old. Please, let us take care of this." Old. The word hit harder than I expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was dismissive. Like everything I'd built, everything I'd learned, could now be erased with a single adjective. I sat back in my chair. The kitchen light flickered softly. Jason locked the tablet screen, placed it on the counter, and said in that polished, managerial tone, "You'll thank us later. We're protecting your legacy." Legacy. Another word for control. The house was silent except for the sound of the rain tapping the windows. Soft, relentless, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. I looked at my daughter. Her arms were crossed, her jaw tight. Somewhere beneath the layers of pride and defensiveness, I thought I could still see the little girl who once cried when she broke her piggy bank. But that girl was gone, replaced by someone who believed money defined love and control proved care. I stood slowly. My chair creaked against the tile. "I understand," I said quietly. Jason smiled, relieved, like a man who just won an argument without realizing he'd lost everything else. I walked to the front door. Behind me, Emma muttered something I didn't catch. Maybe another justification, maybe just noise. I put on my coat, opened the door, and felt the cool air hit my face. The rain had stopped, but the world outside still smelled of thunder. For a moment, I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, heart steady, voice silent. And that's when it hit me, a truth sharp enough to cut through the quiet. That was the moment I realized I wasn't their mother anymore. I was their account number. I stepped out and closed the door gently behind me. No shouting, no slamming, just quiet rage. The kind that simmers instead of burns, that builds something cold and clear inside you. They thought they'd silenced me. They thought they'd taken everything, my money, my access, my voice. But they'd forgotten one thing. I said nothing, but the law would. The morning after that night, I woke up to a silence that felt different. Not empty, but focused. The kind that follows a long storm, when everything's still standing, but nothing is the same. I made tea the way I always did. 1 bag, 2 sugars, 1 deep breath. Then I opened my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Grant and Associates, this is Carol speaking." "Hi," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Tell Mr. Grant that Margaret Brooks is calling. He'll remember me." And he did. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in his office. Same mahogany shelves, same framed degrees, same faint smell of old paper and justice. "Margaret," he said, smiling gently as he closed the door behind me, "you still take your tea with honey?" I smiled back, faintly. Not since I started losing my sweetness. He chuckled, a sound halfway between comfort and understanding. Then he gestured towards the chair. "Tell me everything." And so I did. I told him about the trust, the signatures, the missing statements, the locked app, the bounced check, the look in Jason's eyes when he snatched that tablet away. He listened without interruption, just small nods and an occasional note in his leather book. When I finished, the room felt heavier, like the truth itself had weight. He slid the folder I had brought toward him, the copy of the power of attorney Jason had given me to sign. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. Minutes passed. Then, softly, he said, Margaret, did you authorize these addendums? What addendums? I asked. He turned the document toward me. Here. Clause 14B. They've expanded authority beyond basic financial management to include liquidation rights, real property transfers, and discretionary reinvestment privileges. I frowned. That wasn't in the version I read. He nodded grimly. They modified it after your signature. Classic overreach. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and said the words that made the air in the room stop moving. This isn't mismanagement, Margaret. This is financial exploitation of an elder. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The phrase sat there, cold and legal, but underneath it was something heartbreakingly personal. He looked me in the eye. We can fix this, but you'll have to be precise and quiet. He outlined the plan, each step deliberate, methodical, almost surgical. First, he said, we'll contact your bank's fraud division, request an immediate temporary freeze on all accounts under your name, pending verification of power of attorney misuse. It's your right. He wrote a note, signed it with quick strokes. Next, he continued, we'll contact the Elder Financial Protection Services. They'll flag your case for investigation. These agencies work fast when large sums are involved. He looked up at me. Do you know where the money might be? I hesitated. Jason mentioned crypto once and something about leveraged loans. Mr. Grant sighed softly. Then it's worse than I thought. He stood, walked to his computer, and began typing. I'm pulling records through the bank liaison. If those transfers were made from your accounts, they're traceable. The room filled with the faint hum of the printer, the rhythm of legal machinery coming to life. After a few minutes, he looked up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Found something, he said. Several large transfers, all within the past 60 days, funneled through shell accounts, then into high-risk crypto platforms registered under Jason Cole Investments. My heart sunk, but my jaw tightened. So, he gambled with my life savings? Mr. Grant met my eyes. No. He gambled with his freedom. We spent hours building the case. Every email, every bank notice, every detail I remembered, he logged them meticulously. By the time the sun began to set, we had what he called a quiet freeze protocol. The plan was simple. Act before they noticed. The bank would freeze all outgoing transfers within 48 hours. The investigation team would begin tracing every dollar. And Jason, for all his talk of liquidity, would soon find his ocean turned to ice. Mr. Grant leaned back, exhaled, and finally allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. You're not weak, Mrs. Brooks. You're just too polite. The words hit me harder than any insult Jason had ever thrown, because he was right. For years, I'd mistaken silence for grace. I thought being patient meant being strong. I thought that letting people have their way was somehow loving. But love without boundaries isn't kindness. It's permission for others to cross you. I nodded slowly. Politeness ends today. We finalized the paperwork. Mr. Grant printed copies, sealed envelopes, and handed me one. This one, he said, goes directly to the Fraud and Compliance Division. Deliver it in person. Don't email, don't call, just walk in and hand it to the manager. The moment they read this clause, he tapped the page, the accounts will lock automatically. I held the envelope like a relic. $10 million and 35 years of my life compressed into a single piece of paper. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. Outside, the city was wrapped in evening gold. That strange kind of light that makes even old things look new. "Margaret," he said, his voice gentler now, "once this begins, there's no turning back. You sure you're ready?" I smiled, not bitterly, not sadly, but with a kind of quiet conviction I hadn't felt in years. I've been ready since the day they told me I was too old to understand my own money. He nodded once, a look of pride flickering in his eyes. "Then let's bring your clarity back." That night, I sat at my desk, the same spot where I once tracked every cent, every receipt, every tax return. I laid the envelope in front of me and traced its edges with my fingers. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. I thought about Jason's buzzwords: liquidity, leverage, growth. Funny how none of them could buy decency. Tomorrow, he'd wake up to a bank account frozen in silence. Emma would try to call only to hear, "Transaction declined." And for the first time in months, I'd be the one holding the key. I looked out the window at the first stars flickering through the clouds and whispered to the night, "Politeness ends today." It started with silence, the kind that hums beneath the surface of ordinary days before something breaks. At 9:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, Jason's card declined. Not at a gas station, not at a grocery store, at a luxury watch boutique in Midtown. The cashier smiled awkwardly, waiting, while Jason frowned at the screen, pretending it was a glitch. He tried another card, then another. Declined, declined, declined. He laughed it off, but his laugh was thin. Probably a bank update. These systems are ridiculous. By noon, his phone began to vibrate nonstop. Notifications stacked like falling bricks. Account temporarily locked, wire transfer failed, transaction reversed, contact fraud and compliance immediately. By 1 p.m., Emma called him from her hair appointment, her voice sharp and fast. "Jason, my card just got declined for $80. What's going on?" He muttered something about server issues, pacing across their glass condo floor, staring at the skyline that no longer felt like his. He opened his laptop. Every portfolio, every crypto wallet, every trading app flashed the same frozen blue banner: pending investigation. Then came the real blow: his brokerage account, the one labeled Cole Family Holdings, locked. The room spun. For the first time in months, he had no numbers to hide behind. That afternoon, a different kind of silence filled my house. Calm, grounded, whole. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light fall across the old oak tree Daniel planted when Emma was born. The phone rang. "Margaret." "Mom," she said, her voice tight, confused. "Something's wrong with the bank. Jason can't move any money. My cards aren't working. Did you change something?" I took a slow breath. The kettle clicked off in the kitchen behind me, soft and steady. "Yes, I did." For a moment, there was only static, the kind stunned where someone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer theirs. "Mom, you don't understand," she began. But I did. I understand perfectly. For once. And I hung up. By evening, the dominoes had all fallen. The tenants in the rental house Jason had sold started calling, confused about who to pay rent to. The title transfer was now flagged under fraud review, halting every payment. His so-called business partners, the ones who'd bragged about early-stage ventures and high-yield assets, started to pull out, fast. Nobody wants to be near a sinking ship. Emma's influencer friends noticed the sudden disappearance of her posts. No more Aspen getaways, no more champagne sunsets. The Commons started turning cold. And Jason, the man who once spoke in acronyms and confidence, now found himself on hold with customer service lines that didn't care who he was. The empire they'd built on charm and borrowed trust was dissolving, one denied transaction at a time. Meanwhile, I stayed home. No drama, no satisfaction calls, no "I told you so." Just quiet. I turned off the lights that night and lit a candle, not out of necessity, but out of peace. The flame flickered gently on the table beside me, casting a soft gold halo across the room. It reminded me of simpler times, before the buzzwords, before the passwords, before love was tangled in leverage and lies. For the first time in months, I could breathe. No more double-checking statements that never came, no more wondering what family trust really meant, no more pretending silence was safety. Just me, a candle, and the hum of stillness that sounded a lot like freedom. Jason would call later that night, of course. He always did when things got hard. His voice would be tight, defensive, coated with false calm. "Mom, there's been a misunderstanding. We can fix this. I just need..." But I'd let it go to voicemail. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was math finally correcting itself. I sat there for a long while, flipping through an old book Daniel once loved, the spine cracked, the pages smelling faintly of dust and memory. I traced a line he'd underlined years ago. "Wealth built on deceit burns fastest." How true, I thought. I smiled then, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. I didn't win the lottery. I just stopped funding my own betrayal. And as the candlelight danced across the pages, I realized something even deeper. I hadn't just frozen their accounts, I had thawed my own heart. It was almost poetic how the story circled back to the same door, the same quiet house, the same morning light filtering through the blinds. Only this time, I wasn't the one trembling. There was a knock. Sharp, uneven, desperate. Then another. Then the sound of Emma's voice cracking through the stillness. "Mom, please, open the door." When I did, they stood there. Unrecognizable. Jason's tailored suit was gone, replaced with a wrinkled shirt and a face that hadn't slept in days. His hair stuck out at odd angles, his confidence washed away. Emma, my beautiful, proud daughter, stood behind him, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Mascara smudged, nails chipped, the kind of fragile you can't Photoshop. "Mom," she whispered, "the landlord's threatening eviction. We just need help for a few weeks, just until things stabilize." I looked at them for a long moment. The last time they had stood here, I was the one holding my breath. Now it was them. "Come in," I said quietly. They stepped inside. The air felt heavier with them in it, a mixture of guilt, perfume, and the faint scent of burnt pride. On the dining table sat a neat stack of papers, bank statements, signed reports, email printouts from investigators, the full record of everything they'd done. Jason's eyes caught the bold header, "Elder Financial Exploitation, Case number 3274B. He swallowed hard. Emma sat down without being asked, her shoulders collapsing inward. "We didn't mean for it to get this bad," she murmured. "We thought we were helping. Jason said the investments were safe." Jason cut in, voice hoarse. The market tanked, okay? It wasn't our fault. No one could have predicted the crash. We were trying to build something for the family. I said nothing. He kept talking, like he could outpace the truth. The trust was meant to protect you. The crypto downturn was temporary. I can fix it. I just need a little capital to... I raised a hand, gently, firmly. Jason, he stopped. You didn't just take my money, I said, my voice soft but steady. You took my peace. The room went silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Emma looked up, tears in her eyes. Mom, we're sorry. We really are. Please just help us get back on our feet. I met her gaze. The same eyes that once looked at me from across a kindergarten classroom, clutching a drawing that said, I love you, Mommy. How far we'd both come. And how far she'd fallen. I gestured to the documents on the table. These, I said, are the records. Every transfer, every transaction, every lie wrapped in a promise. Jason tried to speak again, but I didn't let him. You don't manage my money, I said quietly. I manage the kind of people I allow near it. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. We sat there for a moment that felt like forever. Jason's jaw tightened. His pride tried to recover, but it couldn't stand on broken numbers. Emma's tears came quietly, the way regret often does, late and without direction. I reached for the teapot, poured 3 cups, the same ritual I'd done my whole life, except now the gesture meant something different. Tea? I offered softly. They hesitated, confused by the calm. It's just tea, I said. Not forgiveness. That will take longer. They each took a cup. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Not angry, not bitter, just true. When they were done, I stood. I hope you find your way, I said, walking them to the door, but you'll have to walk it without my money this time. Emma nodded, tears streaking her face. Jason couldn't meet my eyes. I opened the door. The morning air was cool, almost gentle. As they stepped outside, I added softly, and Jason, next time you talk about family legacy, remember this moment. This is what it really costs to lose it. Then I closed the door, not with anger, not with triumph, but with peace. The kettle clicked again in the kitchen, soft and steady. I poured myself one more cup and sat down by the window. The house was quiet. And for the first time in years, it finally felt like home again. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and polished wood, that familiar scent of bureaucracy and truth colliding. A long table divided us. On one side sat the bank representatives, their briefcases gleaming, laptops open, fingers ready to type the fallout of greed. Next to them, 2 investigators, calm, composed, eyes sharp as scalpels. Next to them, Mr. Grant, my attorney and friend, papers neatly stacked, expression unreadable. And across from me, Emma and Jason. They looked smaller than I remembered. Jason's expensive watch was gone, his tie crooked, his hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the evidence binder he didn't want to exist. Emma wore black, her hair tied back, her face pale and blotchy. No makeup this time, just the truth. At the center, the mediator, an older judge with a calm voice, but eyes that had seen too many families torn apart by numbers. "Let's begin," he said. The bank's lead investigator started. "Upon review, we've confirmed multiple unauthorized transfers initiated under Mrs. Brooks's power of attorney. Digital signatures were forged and verified through mismatched IP logs." He clicked the remote. Screens lit up with evidence: charts, dates, transaction trails, like veins of betrayal glowing in cold blue. Funds were diverted into accounts held by Mr. Jason Cole under the entity Cole Family Holdings, later liquidated into high-risk crypto investments and unsecured personal loans. The total loss exceeds 8 figures. Jason shifted in his seat, muttering, "It wasn't theft, it was strategy gone wrong." Mr. Grant didn't look up from his papers. "Strategy doesn't include forgery." The investigator continued, voice steady. "In addition, Mr. Cole attempted to secure further credit extensions using Mrs. Brooks's assets as collateral. These have since been voided." The judge turned to Emma. "Mrs. Cole, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Her lip trembled. "I I didn't know it would go this far." "Didn't know or didn't ask?" the judge replied, gently. "I wiped my eyes. I just wanted to prove I could make it big, that I wasn't just Margaret's daughter living off what she built." Her voice broke on the last word. "I thought I was helping. I swear I did." I watched her, my daughter, the little girl who used to climb into my lap to tell me about her dreams, now breaking under the weight of her own ambition. And yet, I didn't feel anger, just something quieter, sadder. Jason tried to interject, his words sharp but shaking. "This is all exaggerated. I was going to return the money once the project's matured. We just hit market turbulence. Everyone's struggling." The bank rep looked at him, unimpressed. "Sir, you spent $1.2 million on personal expenses, including luxury vehicles and vacations. That's not turbulence. That's theft." The judge raised a hand. "Enough. We've heard sufficient evidence." He shuffled the papers in front of him, his expression weary. "In my ruling," he said slowly, "all accounts, assets, and holdings tied to Mrs. Brooks's original portfolio will be reinstated under her sole control." Jason's head dropped. Emma's hand went to her mouth. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "an injunction will be placed against both Mr. and Mrs. Cole, preventing them from accessing or managing any portion of Mrs. Brooks's finances henceforth." The sound of the gavel, light, final, echoed through the room. There was a pause, a silence heavy with endings. Then the judge looked at me. "Mrs. Brooks," he said gently, "given the nature of the fraud, you have every right to press criminal charges. Would you like to proceed?" The room went still. All eyes turned to me. Emma's tears fell freely now, silent, her shoulders shaking. Jason stared at the table, jaw locked, a man who'd finally run out of words. I took a breath, the kind that comes after a lifetime of holding it in. "No," I said softly. "No?" The judge tilted his head. I met his eyes. "I don't want them to see in jail. I want them to learn how to earn." A murmur swept through the room. Even Mr. Grant looked at me with something like respect, or maybe disbelief. "Mrs. Brooks," the judge said quietly, "that is a unusual choice." I nodded. So was trusting them. Then softer. "But I won't let revenge be the last thing my family remembers about me." The proceedings ended. Papers were signed. Lawyers gathered their files. Jason stood, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Emma approached me slowly, eyes red. "Mom." I reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek, the way I used to when she was small. "You made a mess," I whispered. "Now it's your turn to clean it." She nodded, crying harder. But there was a flicker of something new, humility, maybe, or the start of growth. I turned and walked toward the exit. Outside, the sky had that soft gray light just before rain, cleansing, inevitable. As I stepped into it, I felt the first drop land on my hand, cool and real. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone who had lost everything. I felt like someone who had finally gotten herself back. The morning light returned to my kitchen, the same soft gold that had watched me through every season of the story. The kettle hummed quietly. The tea leaves swirled in the pot like they always had. Nothing grand, nothing loud. Just life, steady again. On the table lay a stack of new envelopes, crisp, clean, free from hidden signatures or clever traps. I opened one. Account summary. Balance reinstated. Interest accrued. Everything back where it belonged. I stared at the numbers, but for the first time in a long time, they didn't make my heart race. They didn't own me. They didn't define me. They were simply what they were. Mine. I took the first interest payment and wrote a check, not to my daughter, not to another investment, but to a foundation that protects seniors from financial exploitation. I thought of the faces I'd met at community centers. Quiet people who'd trusted too easily, who'd signed the wrong paper at the wrong time. People like me. Only now, I wasn't just another name on a list. I was a survivor with a story. As I sealed the envelope, I whispered to the empty room, "I don't need revenge. I need boundaries." The words felt like forgiveness, not for them, but for myself. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside. The air was cool, touched by spring. I walked down the quiet street lined with maple trees, their leaves whispering above me. For months, that road had felt heavy, full of memories I couldn't bear to revisit. Now, it felt lighter, like the past had finally loosened its grip. I passed neighbors, waved, smiled. To them, I was just another woman enjoying the sunshine. But inside, I knew the truth. I had fought for more than money. I had fought for peace, and I had won it back. As the wind brushed my hair and the light warmed my shoulders, I looked up and smiled. "Money came back to its place," I whispered. A pause. "And so did I."